Ask enough hunters in Appalachia, and sooner or later, someone will tell you about the deer, or as some folks call them, not deer. Most folks say they look more or less like normal deer, but there's always something off about them. Something not quite right that you can't fully put your finger on until later. Usually it's the legs. Some folks say that they're on backwards. Others say they walk on two legs or their whole heads are on backwards, while others still can see it in their eyes. Something that sets them apart from the rest of the herd. Something that can make even seasoned hunters turn tail in terror. A lot of people explain these things away by reminding us of the simple fact that deer are weird frickin' animals. There's a modern image of deer as these graceful, tranquil things when they're really just remarkably stupid, surprisingly aggressive, and most of all just plain strange. I always figured that a lot of the supposed sightings of deer can be chalked up to that, although, after some of what's happened recently, I'm not quite stupid enough to straight up state that there's no such thing. I've seen them too, and I know what I saw was one of them. There's a very clear line between the regular kookiness of your average deer and those things out there that are very much not deer, and I've seen what's on the other side of that line. I've seen more than my fair share. It was only about a month or so back when my brother Arland and I headed out for our own little weekend hunting trip. It was near the end of August and would be our last weekend together until Thanksgiving, so we wanted to make it count. Right after Labor Day, we would be back in the city and back to our studies at UGA. A little weekend hunt was more or less tradition for us and had been ever since I had left home. It was a tradition that I had come to love. Arlen and I had been hunting with our dad for most of our lives, and while he was getting a little bit too old for it, the two of us were still in the prime of our youth. We visited our usual spot, a quiet little hunting ground out in the middle of nowhere, and came ready to rough it for a few days. Arlen and I shot the shit as we parked the truck and unloaded our stuff into the little cabin we usually rented. Our little trip was off to a normal enough start, and before the sun had gotten too high, we had made our way into the woods to see what we could find. Things were off to a decent enough start when we found tracks not too far from our cabin. They were fairly fresh, and using them, we crept up on what must have been a group of about 4 to 6 deer. Given the small size of the herd, that probably meant we were on the trail of some bucks, and that could only be good for us. We kept quiet as we tracked the animals, and for a good while we stayed on the trail, slowly gaining on them as they wandered the woods. It couldn't have been more than an hour or so before I spotted movement through the trees. Tall, proud horns moved amongst the foliage, and I watched them closely. From my vantage point, I counted about 4 bucks. They seemed not to notice us and gazed lazily as Arlen and I studied them before planning our shots. From my angle, I could easily put a bullet in its heart. It would be a quick and probably painless death. Arlen had a good shot on another one of the bucks a little further away. Its body was positioned just right, and if we timed it perfectly, we might have gone home with 2 bucks on our first day out. Not a bad haul at all. I steadied my rifle as I trained it on the heart of the nearest deer, and my finger rested on the trigger, ready to pull it before the dang thing moved. Its head shot upright as if it heard a noise, and its eyes fixated on me and Arlen. We were hidden in the foliage, so it really shouldn't have seen us so easily. It smelled us maybe, but not seen. yet it stared at us all the same. I mentioned before that some folks know a deer when they look it in the eyes, and looking into the eyes of that buck, I knew something was off. It's hard to fully describe, but the color seemed wrong. The eyes looked blue, but a vibrant, ice-cold blue. Besides me, I felt Arlen tense up, and I knew he saw exactly what I was seeing. The heads of the other deer turned to look at us as well, moving in a slow unison that sent a chill through me. When faced with danger, people either run or they fight, and every nerve in my body was telling me to run in that moment. But I held my ground all the same and stared into the icy blue eyes of the deer. The blue-eyed buck rose into its hind legs. It did so with relative ease, and as it did, I noticed something odd about the shape of its body. Its limbs seemed just a little too long. Its front legs hung limply in front of it, as its eyes remained trained on me. Its mouth opened, and from it came a surreal, chittering noise. It sounded almost like a child on helium uttering complete nonsense, and yet that combined with its unblinking glare made me want to shrink back. Arlen lowered his rifle and pulled away quickly. "Christ, come on, Mikey, let's get out of here." He nudged my shoulder, but I didn't budge. I kept my rifle trained in that thing, whatever it was, as it babbled madly. And then it took a single step towards me, and I jolted backwards. As I did, I pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the creature dead in the chest. It was a shot that should have blown through its heart and killed it dead. Any normal deer would be dead, but that thing just continued to stand and chitter. The impact of the shot didn't even faze it or cause it to sway. It remained perfectly upright and took another step towards me, eyes still fixated on me. There was almost a malignance in it now, a condescending mockery in its posture. And as it took its third, swaying step, I saw its lips curl back like a snarling dog's, and what was behind them was a set of jagged, gnarled teeth that looked more like a dog's than a deer's. They jutted out of the gums at odd angles that should have made it impossible for it to have ever kept its mouth closed in the first place. What saliva dribbled down its chin, and I finally gave in to my fear and I pulled back. Arlen tugged at my arm, and I didn't fight him for a second. I let him lead me away from those things, and together we raced deeper into the woods. Far behind me, I could hear that hellish chittering growing louder and louder like mocking laughter. No matter how far we seemed to run, we never quite escaped it. Arlen and I didn't leave the cabin for the rest of the day. We told ourselves that we had just run into some weird, overly aggressive buck and that we would be fine the next day. I think we both knew that we were lying. Even the cabin didn't feel quite safe. We had it for a few more days, but we didn't even last one. He had seen me put a goddamn bullet through that deer, and it hadn't even blinked. I probably would have wounded that thing more if I blew a freaking raspberry on its stomach. As the sky began to darken, the woods felt more and more unfriendly. From the corner of my eye, I kept swearing that I saw horns moving amongst the foliage, and while it was probably just my imagination, I didn't like the idea of waiting to find out for sure. "Do you think it might just be best to head home?" Arlen asked as we shared supper, a simple pair of TV dinners. "Just say that we aren't feeling too hot. I got the runs or something like that." I picked at my microwave chicken and gave a quiet nod. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I'm all for that if you are, man. Might just be better if we pack it up now." That was all that was needed to be said on the matter. We barely even finished our dinners before we got our stuff packed up and got the heck out of there. Not much of a hunting trip, but considering how our little encounter had set the mood, could anyone really blame us for hightailing it out of there? That was easily the smartest thing that we could have done at the time. I had hoped that those strange deer would soon be nothing but a bad memory. Boy, was I wrong. Arlen and I were back in Griffin and ready to get on with another semester. The things we saw in the woods were only a sour memory in our minds, soon to become another cryptid tale we shared at parties. I, for one, was more than happy to move on with my life, and hopefully never again need to think about those creatures. My classes started in the afternoon, and went until fairly late in the evening. My first was in a lecture hall that I had been in before, a plain room with a large window overlooking the campus. Nothing all that spectacular, but it was nice enough. I had gotten to class early, so I found a seat by the window. First day lectures were never the most interesting, but at least I would have a nice view, right? The University of Georgia has a pretty nice campus, and that window offered a great view of it. When the professor came in and started the usual beginning of semester spiel, I only half listened to it and took down a few notes as I watched the comings and goings of people on campus. It was a decent enough distraction while I worked. It didn't full out steal my attention until I saw the shape moving in the distance. I only caught a glimpse of it, and it was a little too far away to see clearly. But when I glimpsed it from the corner of my eye, I turned my head to do a double take. Far back, close to the road, I could see something that I could have sworn was a deer standing by one of the buildings. As far as I could tell, no one else but me saw it, but I was sure that it was a goddamn deer. A buck to be precise, and something told me that if I was closer to it, it would have had cold blue eyes. It stared at me, not in my direction, it was looking at me. Even from that distance, I could feel its glare like a physical presence, and felt a cold sweat begin to run down my brow. I looked away from it, focusing on the professor and trying to pretend I hadn't seen what I had just seen, but I couldn't lie to myself. I couldn't deny the truth of it. Even when I finally looked back and saw nothing there, I knew my mind wasn't playing tricks on me. Arlen never made it back to our dorm that night. When I came home from classes, I would have told him everything, but the room was empty. I had seen his schedule. He should have been back hours ago. Heck, even if he wasn't in, he would have at least told me where he went, right? I did take a walk around the dorm looking for him. At that time of night, there weren't many people around. I was well enough alone, and yet I still felt watched. No, more than watched. Stalked. I never found any trace of Arlen. Something tells me I never will. Last night, when I got back after my search, I saw a shape through my window. Something tall and standing on its hind legs. Something with antlers and blue eyes that shone in the darkness, and while I couldn't stare at it for too long before it vanished, it told me everything that I needed to know. Our little hunting trip never really ended. No, we're just not the ones doing the hunting anymore.